All right, everyone. It is 2 minutes after 12. My name is Mark Castiglione. I'm the president of the New York Upstate chapter of the American Planning Association, and I'm so happy you're able to join us to kick off our 2021 Joint Planning Conference. Thank you for attending this session in particular, Accessory Dwelling Units as Affordable Housing. And we are pleased this year to be partnered with the New York Planning Federation to provide this conference. I'm going to be one of your hosts today, and assisting as a co-host is John Cantner of the New York Planning Federation. Before I introduce John, I'm going to go through a couple of housekeeping items. First, we'd like to thank our premier sponsor for this conference, Hodgson and Russ, and the sponsor for this session, the LaBerge Group. Without our partners and sponsors, we would not be able to provide this conference this year. We also wanted to let you know that conference sessions are being recorded and will be available after this session is completed on the chapter's conference webpage and YouTube channel. Links will be provided on the Eventbrite page as soon as we are done processing the video. So please give it a couple days for that to happen. Attendees are automatically muted. If you have any questions, please submit them in the Q&A box. We will address questions after the end of the session. So please, just jot down those questions as we go, and then we will start getting through them after our speakers are done. We are providing the session CM credit number. I provided that in the chat box for AICP planners. It is 922-1234. Attendees seeking Planning and Zoning Board member credit will receive an email confirming your attendance for this session and this session's eligibility for Planning and Zoning Board member training credits 24 hours after the completion of this session. So be on the lookout for that email around 1 o'clock tomorrow. In the email you can present to your town board clerk for logging your Planning and Zoning Board member training credit. So without any further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce my co-host today, John Cantner. He is the Planning Board Chair of the town of Fishkill in Dutchess County. He's also a board member of the New York Planning Federation. So John, please take it away.
Thank you, Mark. I'm glad to be here. On behalf of the New York Planning Federation, I'd like to welcome everyone to this month-long conference and to say how pleased the Planning Federation is to be co-sponsoring this conference with the New York Upstate chapter of the American Planning Association. Today's session is titled Accessory Dwelling Units as Affordable Housing. With increasing affordability issues in New York, communities must now utilize more creative strategies to tackle the problem. One promising approach is the use of accessory dwelling units, or ADUs. ADUs, sometimes referred to as in-law apartments, can provide more flexibility for property owners to construct a second living unit within an existing dwelling, an accessory structure, or as a standalone dwelling unit. However, there are numerous issues communities must take into consideration, and sometimes well-meaning regulations can add unnecessary barriers to ADUs, as well as result in unanticipated impacts to surrounding neighborhoods. This webinar will review various types of ADUs, their pros and cons, how they may help provide more affordable housing, alternative regulatory strategies, and recommendations on how to craft workable regulations in your community. So I'd like to introduce today's speakers, Nicole Allen and Matt Rogers. Nicole Allen, AICP, is Director of Planning and Community Development at LaBerge Group. With 20 years of experience, Ms. Allen has developed and managed a wide range of planning projects, including zoning regulation review and development, land use and subdivision regulations, design guidelines, comprehensive plans, and community development strategies. Her zoning knowledge has assisted communities with code revisions to address best practices and a range of new issues such as alternative energy structures. Ms. Allen has served as a planning consultant to numerous municipal boards to oversee the site plan and subdivision review processes. And Matt Rogers, AICP, is Senior Planner at LaBerge Group. Mr. Rogers brings over 20 years of experience securing, managing, and delivering a variety of projects for both public and private sector clients. His project experience includes comprehensive recreation and special district planning, land use regulation, and zoning law preparation and design guidelines. Mr. Rogers also regularly performs site plan and subdivision plan reviews, as well as permitting and seeker compliance services. So let's turn the presentation over to Nicole Allen and Matt Rogers.
Thank you very much, John. We're very happy to be here today and kicking off the series of webinars, so thank you. So we're going to start off with just a quick agenda. So I'm going to start with the accessory dwelling units, what they are, the history of the ADUs, and then the recent trends. And then we'll talk about some past and current challenges, and then I'll turn it over to Matt to dive into some of the affordability issues, the regulatory issues, and some of the efforts that we have going on in our state to help create this opportunity within many of the communities. So the ADUs, so there's a long history with ADUs. So what are they? A lot of communities struggle with identifying the term, and we'll hear a lot of different terms as we go forward in this presentation. But essentially, it's a dwelling unit that is accessory to a principal dwelling unit on the lot. And that's important. So there has to be a principal structure there for it to be accessory to. By definition, it's smaller than the principal structure. So you'll see many codes that will say they have to be at least 50% of the size, or they'll have different thresholds for defining what makes it accessory. But the idea is that there's something in place that distinguishes it as less than the principal. On average, these units, if we look at a range of codes, are from 600 square feet to 1,200 square feet. That's kind of a very broad range. But even that, there are exceptions to those rules. The International Residential Code goes as small as 88 square feet. So they can be very small, and they can be much larger depending on what that principal structure is. They come in three typical forms. One is attached, detached, and an internal. And how communities have chosen to allow them or disallow them has gone on in a variety of methods. But the detached is just that. It's not attached at all to the structure. It has a separate entrance. It's a separate building. Attached is physically attached to the primary or principal structure. It still has a separate entrance. And then there are other examples where they're above garage or interior lower. I've had friends that have lived in an interior basement that has had a separate entrance that has been modified to be an accessory that way. And so there's multiple different kinds of examples of how these can be developed. So the key part of being an accessory dwelling unit is that it's self-contained. And so it will need to have at least one bedroom. Sometimes there's 2 bedrooms or more. There's a full kitchen, there's a full bathroom, and there's a separate entrance. All those make it self-contained as far as being able to provide a living quarters for an individual or small family. Another key piece is that it's got to be unable to be bought or sold. So it's not subdividable. It's on the same lot as the principal dwelling, in that it's typically an owner-occupied principal dwelling that at least helps maintain some control of the site and be able to typically be able to monitor the other unit as well. We mentioned some different terms that are used. You hear the word in-law apartment, accessory apartment, granny flat, garage apartment. We threw out there the Fonzie flat. Many people are familiar with that one as well. But they come in all different looks and shapes. There was a while ago, they were called echo units, elderly cottage housing units. And so the idea is that we've always tried to create a resolution to a need, and being able to identify how we're going to create some housing opportunities for whether it be a specific demographic or be able to create some affordability within the community. So as we look at the history of them, it's not new. It's something that's been along for a very long time. A lot of communities have created these units to be able to problem solve with being able to provide housing within a community. They fell out of favor right around World War II when we started doing the typical subdividing of lots, similar to the picture you see in front of you, where you had the larger lots, you had the single family house, and we had created a lot more. This is my space. We created the Euclidean zoning. We created the setbacks. We created a lot of what would go into places defining that single family homestead. And as a result of these suburbs that grew, and there was just more of a demand for that type of housing, and the accessory smaller units were either prohibited or just forgotten about for the time being. But that shift began at that point. I'm gonna go ahead, Matt. So a lot of them, as that shift towards single family occurred, these type of units became either illegal, they were prohibited in zoning, or but as part of that, the demand didn't go away. Sometimes they were created illegally, and there were people that converted their garages, that converted spaces to be able to accommodate an individual in their family need that needed it, an elderly family member, or a rental unit. But that demand didn't go away. In San Francisco, by the 60s, there was a tremendous amount of them that were being built. 90% of them were illegal. And then looking at 2009, additionally in California, you were seeing that there was this huge influx of illegal units as well. 34% to 80% of the single family dwellings had illegal accessory dwelling units. And so as a result of a lot of this push, California has been on the forefront of being able to look at their codes and be able to start looking at how they can create some opportunity to encourage and allow these to become legal units moving forward. So since it was a valid issue, and then you start looking at public health concerns and being able to comply with fire prevention and building code, challenges with illegal units is that you have houses that struggle with sales. It impacts their ability for them to go on market, contributing to neighborhood impacts. There's a lot of negative impacts that are perceived by accessory dwelling units, that they're going to change the character of the community. And so a lot of those are valid concerns, and being able to address those in the community is one of the ways that a lot of regulations are starting to look at, and how to be able to fit them into the community so you don't have these transportation parking problems within a community, so that it doesn't look and feel like it's not going to fit with the neighborhood, that you have an ability to have that blend more appropriately, but providing some of the accommodations. So when looking at kind of these terms and this trends going back, and there's a recent Freddie Mac study that scanned a lot of these listings, you see more and more of them on the market, that there's not just this universally accepted term. You can see guest houses and guest suites and in-law suites and carriage houses. And even today, I would say they're even more catchy with the Airbnb market, and being able to put some of these on the market for rental, or for opportunity for just kind of a unique experience within communities, and from an economic development standpoint as well. And so it's not just for the traditional put your in-laws in place in a home, or be able to provide a place for a student or a young adult to live, but communities are starting to look at how these can fit better into providing some economic opportunity as well. So looking at these listings, so the number of listings and how they've been rising over time. This starts back, the chart there is from 1997, and looking into more recent 2018. And the growth of the ADUs on average has grown over 8.6% per year. In 2000, only 1.6% of active for sale listings had accessory dwelling units. However, by 2019, those were almost 7%, which is an incredible growth in those that are being permitted, but also those that are starting to be constructed and also being accepted into the market as something that is desirable within communities. And a lot of those from the slide here are also rentals. So they're not just for those that are just going to house some family member, but they're really looking at the rental market as well. And this illustrates some of the growth in the concentration of attached and detached accessory dwelling units in the nation. You'll see some of the larger areas of concentration in California and in Portland, Oregon. California has recently adopted legislation that would enable to have not just one accessory dwelling unit, but two, so they call it triplex. You can have the standard accessory unit within your lot, and then you could also convert your garage space into a second one or a junior, smaller unit. So they're providing a lot of flexibility. They've also increased the accessory dwelling units by allowing the typical homeowners association, which might have prohibited it, to now allow those areas to also have accessory dwelling units. So they've really taken on the problem of a lot of their illegal units to be able to address those. And you're seeing also in the shift in the Northeast being able to start to look at those opportunities as well. And this is based on a 2020 source. So these recent trends, where does New York stand? And trying to identify how you fit within the national standards. And so looking at California, as I mentioned, was extremely high in the number of units that are out there. New York is kind of in the average. You can see it circled there. It's ranked 8th overall. And so it's still up there as an area that has that concentration, and it's fast growing in the ADUs and those that are entering the market. So it's something to be aware of as those trends are shifting and pushing communities to start looking at that. And it's also starting to be something that individuals are seeking out as a desirable amenity, that they want to be able to have that flexibility to either be able to accommodate their family members or be able to accommodate revenue from an economic standpoint as well. So some of the challenges that are going along with the ADUs is that zoning laws have not been something that would accommodate them. They've typically sought to separate anything that was an accessory type of dwelling. And this graphic here shows that New York City has 15% of its residential land zoned for detached single family dwellings. And then the pink is where kind of just showing how that fits into the community, being able to show the higher density and offsetting some of that growth related to the ADUs. And some of the local and higher percentages are starting to see more of a concentration in other areas where the ADUs are being encouraged. And you can see this in the example looking at some of our other communities nationwide. Sandy Springs, Georgia is 85%. Charlotte, North Carolina is 84%. And so trying to accommodate filtering these into the community is definitely something that is starting to press more and more locally. San Jose, California is 94%, and then Portland, Oregon is 77%. So it's something that is definitely a national trend that communities need to be aware of and identify how to start looking at their own code to overcome these challenges. From a challenge standpoint, the existing dwelling unit is still the primary dwelling. And so looking at how that's defined and being able to look at how an accessory dwelling could fit in. A lot of codes will focus on some of the setback requirements. And so we have to look at how where those structures are placed, whether they can be converted, or they meet the minimum square footage. How does the higher density fit into the current communities that you have as far as what those are currently zoned? And does it embrace that traditional feel, or is it going to push it into something that's going to look and feel a little different? And that's where communities are starting to examine themselves and be able to see if that's the right fit as far as being something that's going to be realistic to be able to accommodate. And when we look at those challenges, a lot of them are requiring a special use permit. So that's an extra step that goes into place. There's the owner occupancy requirement that a lot of times accommodates it, accompanies it, and making sure that that principal dwelling is going to stay owner occupied. How do you track that? Is the tenant going to be a relative or a property owner also of the property owner? And so there's a lot of tracking that goes into place when we start thinking about the user of that space, rather than just how that space is going to be built or developed. And so looking at a preferred process of making them either as of right or a site plan review, something that streamlines it so that it creates the opportunity without having to make it very difficult to move forward with. Other obstacles or barriers is the lot size requirements. Sometimes lot sizes are too small to be able to accommodate such a structure. Whether it's attached or internal, sometimes those are obstacles that prohibit someone from being able to construct or be able to provide that secondary access that would be completely separate. Many communities have thought of these as temporary uses that would, put your in-law, your elderly family member in, and then at some point they would remove them. But the cost associated with these units is too expensive to expect somebody to want to remove a well-built and connected piece of a dwelling unit that's connected into the infrastructure in place. It's just too expensive. But looking at parking requirements and the maximum sizes is going to be part of what becomes part of the regulatory barriers, and trying to understand what the maximums and the minimums should be to make it work from a financial standpoint, as well as something that doesn't change the character. There we go. And so I'm going to pass it off to Matt to talk about how do we address these housing needs.
Okay, thank you, Nicole. Good afternoon, everybody. So obviously, you're likely familiar with the fact that the nation and the state have been experiencing some lack of affordable housing issues. So we wanted to start by kind of breaking this down by the state and then down to the local level. So in 2018, the New York State share of rent burden, severely rent burdened, meaning that you're spending more than 50% of your income. Clearly, the lower the household income, the higher the percentage of households that are severely rent burdened. And obviously that places a lot of pressure on communities to provide more affordable housing, primarily for the lower to moderate income households. And it's not only an issue for renters, it's also a concern for homeowners in the state as well. So while the trend clearly has decreased, kind of plateauing in 2008 with the fiscal crisis, then it has come down, but not dramatically. And this data goes through 2017. So it'd be interesting to see the impacts of the COVID pandemic, because that's obviously has likely increased the percentage of homeowners that are above the affordability threshold, as well as those with severe housing cost burdens of 50% or more. And getting down to the capital region, you can see that in most of the counties, almost 50% on average of renter households are cost burdened. And in areas where you have a low percentage of rental units available, combined with a lower median household income, you can start to see well above 60% of the renters are household burdened. In other counties such as Saratoga, where you have a higher median income, also you do have a relatively low percentage of rental units. The percentage of rent burdened households isn't as high as you see elsewhere, but it's certainly an issue. So that demonstrates that regardless of the average income of the county, you're likely to see some significant impacts, particularly on the renting community. So we do a lot of work in Ulster County, City of Kingston, Town of Esopus, and we're kind of in tune with what's going on there. And this year, the county released a comprehensive housing action plan that looked at a significant amount of data and identified some really good workable solutions. So since 2010, the median rent has increased by 16% and the household income down about 1%. Clearly, that's within the margin of error, but the trend is that the household income has slightly decreased. And of course, there's been a lot of factors over the last decade that have contributed to that. But regardless, that does demonstrate that it starts to get a little out of sync here, increasing the percentage of people that are house burdened. And the average sale price, particularly in Ulster County, has increased, and you can see that up and down the Hudson Valley, as well as the capital region. So as those housing prices increase, it starts to put more and more individuals out of the market for purchasing a home. And in terms of severely rent burden, 13% of homeowners, and again, this is households that spend 50% or more of their income. It's 13% for homeowners and 30% for renters. And the general accepted factor is 30% or more, and that's generally being household burden. So having 30% of renters severely household burden in the county is certainly a significant issue and a cause of concern. Also contributing to this is something that's seen nationwide, is that the average size of homes, primarily single-family dwellings, have been increasing. And in Ulster County, it's a little over 2,000 square feet with a median sale price of almost $500,000. So all these factors really do contribute to some significant housing concerns. So where does accessory dwelling units come into play into this equation? Do they mainly serve as extra living spaces, offices, or sources of short-term rental income? So in terms of local studies within the New York area, they're fairly limited, but I would expect that these are going to start to become more relevant and more local studies be done. But in Portland in 2013, again, that's somewhat dated information, but it's a starting point for them. Nearly 80% of all of the accessory dwelling units were being used short-term, and that was a survey of the property owners by the city. A follow-up study, which gives us a little bit more recent data, shows that 3/4 of the listings were rented between 262 and 371 days. And this was primarily Texas, California, Florida, Georgia, and Arizona. So if you remember back at the data that Nicole was discussing, where there was a high percentage of accessory dwelling units, you mostly saw those in the South, the Sun Belt, and out West, where there is a clear housing need because of the legacy zoning of single-family zoning. So, and what this data shows between 262 to almost 400 days is that these are clearly not short-term rentals. These are not 30 days or less is what the accepted term of short-term. So these are being leased out for long-term purposes. So given the information that's been out there, the decision to construct accessory dwelling units are generally being driven by homeowner need. So it's a care for the elderly, parent, guest house, extra space, rental income, or for that teenager that just won't leave the house, you build them an accessory dwelling unit and stick them in that. Clearly, affordable alternative for families to provide independent living spaces for their family is a driving factor. And increasing local affordability may not be a major factor for homeowners that decide to build accessory dwelling units. And I think that's probably a reasonable assumption based upon the data that's out there, and also given the costs to construct accessory dwelling units. While constructing an ADU on your own property is cheaper than starting new, since you already own the land, at least we're presuming that. So it is a little cheaper. However, prefabricated and site-built can range between $30,000 to well over $100,000. And that doesn't include the cost for installation, the utility hookups, and those extensions that are required, as well as the local approvals. However, as accessory dwelling units and tiny homes are starting to catch on a little bit more, the manufactured home industries are now starting to provide concepts and pre-built manufactured structures for this actual situation. And you can also buy building plans through a variety of outlets. And these accessory dwelling unit and tiny home construction has been really prevalent out west and in the south. But we are starting to see more and more of the local manufactured home construction companies, as well as small startup businesses to build these. Some of them are, again, they're kits or they're prefab, and others will build the suit. There's actually a handful within the capital region as well. And it's interesting to see how those are now becoming more prevalent. So given the fact that ADUs are generally built by the homeowner and based on their decision to provide additional space, whether that's for their own purposes or renting out to supplement their income or to provide space for a family member, etc. Communities, need to consider these just one tool in your toolbox, if you will, to provide additional housing. Obviously, communities can't require construction of an ADU, and certainly we haven't run into communities where they're actively facilitating this. In communities that have dire housing issues, particularly in the south and out west, we'll talk about a few of those. They are providing a lot more incentives. So clearly there needs to be more diverse options out there, and it needs to be combined with overall increase in housing options. So reducing or completely eliminating single family dwelling only districts, and that clearly has been a hot topic over the last few years and likely only to increase given the negative impacts of COVID and the overall increase in housing costs. And along with that, you want to incorporate additional options. So in most communities that we work in, sometimes it is slow to move that discussion forward, to introduce more than just single family homes in districts. So starting off small is a good option for the ADUs because it's incremental. And then duplex, triplex is obviously a multifamily, and then allowing tiny homes as well. So I like this graphic done by Opticos, full credit to them. But what this does is it demonstrates that between, on the left side, the detached single family homes, on the right side, your more dense urban metropolitan type development, mid-rise, mixed use, commercial first floor, residential up floor. This leaves out a huge amount of housing that if you look at a lot of community zoning, you are on one extreme, you get the detached single family dwelling and then higher density, very high cost development on the right side. So within that middle, missing middle housing is where the ADUs come into play, but they must be incorporated with other options within the communities that need to be allowed within their zoning. So as I mentioned before, it's an incremental approach. It's an interesting way to gently increase the density in communities, particularly those that have had traditionally single-family home zoning. And Nicole will vouch for this, and I'm sure a lot of planners that work in a variety of communities. Once you start to discuss workforce housing, affordable housing, higher density, it does take some time to work through the concerns, identify those, and provide opportunities and regulations that meet those concerns, but at the same time allow for an incremental increase in the higher density, and ADUs are certainly one way to go about that. And as I said before, this doesn't result in an immediate impact on the neighborhood. So as opposed to a 50-unit multifamily coming in, which is clearly needed in a lot of communities, that may not be the best approach right off the bat, and allowing for more flexibility to provide for more affordability options through ADUs is a great start. And of course, it doesn't enhance the affordability for renters and help supplement homeowner income. So in terms of where they are targeting affordable housing issues, and the data is still, coming in, and this is something that we're watching and will continue to watch as an important part of our planning practice here at LaBerge. But in city of Boston, they piloted, and it's now a official and formal program, or a formal program rather. It allows low and moderate income homeowners to receive zero interest loans up to $30,000. However, it's limited to within the existing structure. And as the bar graph shows here, that over the first pilot year, 72 applied, but only 2 received certificates of occupancy, 12 permits were issued. There's no recent data on how many more of those 12 permits have been constructed, but they did consider this as a success, and they formalized the program, and they're looking to tweak the review process. And I would imagine that they may start to branch out into detached units as well. And this was done in just a handful of neighborhoods within the city. So it's a good start, and this demonstrates that communities that have the ability to do this fiscally to address a housing problem have to provide opportunities for financing. Because again, as the data shows, most individuals that build the ADUs aren't necessarily thinking that I'm going to help with the long-term affordability issues. Obviously, there are individuals out there that do that, and that's fantastic. So in addition to municipalities, Lama's Backyard Home Project in Los Angeles, it's a nonprofit organization run by planners, architects, and engineers that donate their time. Well-designed rentals LA can afford is their mission, and allows homeowners to provides financing, affordable design, construction management, free project management services to homeowners that agreed to rent their accessory dwelling units to Section 8 voucher holders for a minimum of 5 years. So this is an incentive, a carrot and stick approach to address a serious housing issue that is within Los Angeles and California. I believe now allows ADUs as of right, eliminates a lot of those initial barriers. And the city of Napa, they have what are called junior unit initiative programs. So a junior unit is their term for a dwelling or accessory dwelling unit within your primary structure. They also allow for financing for existing conversion of ADUs in existing accessory structures, so that's your garage, if you will, or above your garage. And through this, it provides deferred interest loans, low-income loans, and free technical assistance. So in terms of New York, most recently, the New York State Senate, and this bill appears to still be under Judiciary Committee. It hasn't made it out of committee yet. But they're looking at more of a stick approach, we'll say, where they, within this law, which has not passed, but would direct municipalities to make certain accessory dwelling units legal under local law without imposing any overly or onerous restrictions. Also would direct the Department of State to work with local governments to make sure these laws meet the requirements. And actually, the way the law is written now, and it's only in draft form, is that all communities would have to submit their local laws for review. So essentially would require communities allow accessory dwelling units in designated areas, that being all areas zoned for single-family homes, multifamily homes, and on all lots with an existing residential use. Would prohibit short-term rentals, which is something that we agree with, and some communities we work with, we've added that stipulation. Limits the size to 50% of the principal dwelling, and that's a component that I think is still up for debate and actually putting on these arbitrary limits. But it's a start, at least from a New York State legislative component, because we've seen limits of 25 and 30% of your principal dwelling, and that could really create a restraint that makes it not as appealing to a homeowner as Nicole went through those other barriers. And ADU should not be counted towards the allowable residential density, which should also be a given. If it's an accessory structure, it should not be counted towards your density, so that you do not have to have twice the minimum lot size in order to build that accessory dwelling unit. So also within this draft legislation, the minimum square footage cannot be set at anything greater than 200 square feet, and the maximum cannot be less than 1,500 square feet. So obviously, it looks to allow for larger ADUs if your principal structure is significantly larger. And as I mentioned earlier, the average size of single-family homes seems to only be increasing. You cannot set greater setback requirements than what's already allowed for, say, a shed or garage. Absolutely no parking requirements. And it requires a ministerial review without discretionary or a hearing. And, in some communities, that might be a bit hard to swallow, and that's reasonable. And I think that's probably because of these preempt type requirements here is why it may take some time to work its way through the review process within the legislature. It requires a 60-day review and approval process, and any existing ADU regulations that fail to meet the requirements of the law, if passed, become null and void. And there is an owner occupant requirement for up to at least 1 year after that, according to the draft rules, that no longer is a requirement. So this is something that communities clearly need to keep an eye on, see how it goes through the review process in the legislature, and see if it continues to move more in the line of preempting local zoning as compared to trying to work with communities. And kind of the one beef I have with this is that it's great from a legislative standpoint, but without some type of statewide fiscal support for low-income loans and other types of carrot and stick approaches, this will only be a small step towards addressing the issue in the state. Also in 2020, the state added Appendix Q to the residential uniform code, where it now has a definition of what a tiny house is, which is under 400 square feet. And with this comes a lot of the health and safety requirements and design requirements that I know as we worked in a lot of communities, we were always asked about tiny homes, and the building inspectors were kind of at a loss because there weren't regulations in place to allow for these very small units. Now, not all accessory dwelling units are tiny homes, but there clearly are some out there, particularly those prefab ones that you can find in a lot of manufactured homes, and also those that specialize in accessory dwelling units. They do go down below 400 square feet. So the city of Albany, I believe it was 2017, they adopted a unified sustainable development ordinance. ADUs are allowed with very limited permitting. They're allowed in single-family detached dwellings, and also, which is an interesting element, is for non-residential uses in mixed-use districts, so kind of a caretaker type situation. So that's an interesting one that I feel is appropriate to replicate elsewhere, and they have no parking requirements. The city of Kingston, we're working with the city, and they're undergoing a comprehensive zoning update, looking at a form-based code for the entire city. Prior to moving forward with the zoning update, the city was batting around ideas to significantly expand the accessory dwelling units there. Not quite along the approach that the legislator is looking at, legislative component is looking at in Albany. But it did provide a lot of additional opportunities for accessory dwelling units, and that's currently on hold and going to be reviewed as part of the full zoning update. Not accessory dwelling units, but the city also issued an RFP back in March for a private developer to construct a tiny home community to house up to 30 homeless or low-income individuals in 15 units within the first year. And it's modeled on similar programs in Ithaca and Syracuse. So this just demonstrates that, okay, now the state has issued new allowances for tiny homes. City of Kingston, which does have an affordability issue, it is in Ulster County, clearly is taking it right to the development community and looking to partner to provide these types of opportunities in these smaller situations, smaller type homes and dwelling units. Most recently, we worked with the town of Esopus to complete their comprehensive zoning update. Originally, they did allow for accessory dwelling units, accessory apartments, but we worked with the community to try to expand upon the opportunities and now allow for internal attached and detached dwelling units. They do not count towards the residential density. You do not have to have twice the amount of density. Their original requirement is that you had to have at least 1 acre. And so that's no longer a requirement. Given the significant prevalence of short-term rentals, particularly in the Ulster County and the Mid-Hudson region, right now the town decided to put a 5-year prohibition on short-term rentals of accessory dwelling units, with the ability, of course, to revisit that if after 5 years there still is a concern about these being built specifically for short-term rentals. For just about every one of them, only a building permit is needed. So that's ministerial. That's the preferred approach. If there are situations where the lot's small and fitting the accessory dwelling unit on there would require some additional site plan approval, that would be required, particularly or specifically for those that are detached. General standards to maintain the existing neighborhood character. So looking to kind of meet or be consistent with the general architectural standards within the neighborhood, and also looking to particularly in the areas that are single family only, to make sure that the entrances don't start to look like you're having multiple family dwellings in the neighborhood, and at least 1 off-street parking space is required. So obviously in a more urban area where you do have on-street parking and also public lots, you can get away with not requiring a parking space, but this was one of these negotiated components of the town of Esopus is to require a off-street parking because it is generally a suburban community with Port Ewan being their primary hamlet. But again, it is something where we had to go through negotiations and as we pushed this to be more open and available for property owners, there had to be some concessions. And we feel that the law is going to help the community see more of these accessory dwelling units for a variety of purposes. So just to wrap up here, because it's getting close to 1. So just in terms of general recommendations to expand accessory dwelling units in communities is to allow them as of right with reasonable requirements and really have to be dependent upon the situation. So Kingston's different than Esopus, Amsterdam is different than town of Guilderland or the city of Albany. And so they really need to be written with the local community in mind, but have a lot of other of those requirements kind of tossed aside. So site plan might be required for certain challenging locations, but certainly that should be a last resort. Do not count against the residential density because this is an accessory unit, and counting against it will only limit where these could occur. Allow for all the varieties, internal attached and detached. Also allow for manufactured structures because those can be brought in and they can look just as good as a site-built home. And with the new Appendix Q with the residential standards allowing for tiny homes, this will increase this opportunity. Also allows a caretaker unit for non-residential uses like the city of Albany is doing, which I think is a very unique requirement. Limit owner-occupied requirement. The state would require it to be 1 year. And that might be something where, again, it's a negotiation component with the municipality to ensure that these aren't being built specifically for renting of both of the units. And consider pre-approved designs for faster permitting. I believe in Seattle, they have up to 4 or 5 pre-approved designs that are ready to go, and that would increase the permitting and review process or decrease the process required for review. And I believe the city of Kingston is something that they're kicking around as well, and that provides a much easier approach. So people that are interested can go in and take a look at these designs. Communities can even have agreements with the provider, et cetera. And finally, and I think this is most important, is that the state really needs to look at, in addition to the stick approach, providing that incentive through low financing rates or forgivable loans, particularly if they are willing to rent to lower income individuals. So any type of preemptive type regulations the state might be looking at, we hope that they'll also combine that with some statewide funding and incentive programs. Would clearly be beneficial and an important part of this key tool to addressing affordability issues in the state. So that's where we're at for the situation. Like I said, we'll keep looking at this, and you'll likely see an article or two in the future, and we look forward to future presentations where we can discuss how the state is moving forward on this important issue. So we will stand by for any type of questions or discussions. Thank you.
Okay. Let me see if I can get my video back on here. All right. Well, we have some very good questions for you. Let's start off with a general one. Justin asks, where or how does the line get drawn between zoning for multiple dwelling units versus accessory dwelling units?
Could you repeat that? I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's basically where or how does the line get drawn between zoning for multiple dwelling units versus accessory dwelling units?
I can handle this one. So the big difference that we see is multiple dwelling units are essentially 3 or more units on a lot, whereas accessory dwelling units generally is just 1 unit with a single family home. And there have been discussions in some communities about, do we allow an accessory dwelling unit for a 2-family home or 3-family home? And the concerns there is not everybody can have an accessory dwelling unit if you have a multi-family home. And the other issue too is that individuals kind of lump accessory dwelling units, that whether that's an internal or an external unit, as the same as multifamily, and that clearly isn't. And there's completely different components to that, and generally would be smaller than the principal dwelling, and then the impacts in the neighborhood would be smaller as well. And introducing this into a single family residential neighborhood obviously has some growing pains, and that's why when we worked with the SOPIS, it was it was somewhat of a long process to get through all the concerns and looking at the various neighborhoods that you might see them in, and make sure that it is not a backdoor approach to adding multifamily dwellings if they are in fact not allowed, because there are some districts in every community that still only allow single family or single and 2-family, and that is a growing issue that communities have to address. But through good public outreach and conversations with the public and the stakeholders, generally can tend to get over those concerns most of the time.
Mark, do you want me to keep going with questions? I have a list here ready to go.
Sound prepared. Go for it.
All right. I think this probably follows up to something you were talking about, but have any communities tried to prohibit accessory apartments in dwelling units that are not owner occupied? And so the question goes on to elaborate why that might have non-owner occupied units may have some additional impacts regarding overcrowding, noise, and parking. But do you have can you refer to any specific examples of communities that have done that in terms of their regulations?
That prohibit accessory dwelling units unless they're owner occupied?
Yes.
Yeah. I'm not going to call out particular communities, but there are ones, close by to us in Albany that very specifically the first line is it must be owner occupied. No time frame, like we discussed, where the state, their pending legislation this requires a 1 year, and I think that's reasonable because it's a decision, an investment decision by the homeowner to do this, and it's not 100% a revenue decision necessarily. So yeah, there are a variety of mostly the suburban communities around Albany. If they even allow them, accessory dwelling units, the top line requirement is you have to be either, a combination too of it has to be owner occupied, and then the person that you allow in your ADU has to be a relative, a family member. And over the last 10 years, the definition of family obviously has now evolved from a constitutional standpoint. So a lot of those codes that I looked at likely need to be updated anyway, because they're already discriminating in terms of how they define their family of who can live in a home. So yeah, they're out there, they're still out there. And that could also be a reason why the state, did a survey and probably found a high percentage of communities that require a homeowner be in the primary dwelling unit or even actually the accessory dwelling unit. And that's a way to kind of force that to go away. So unfortunately, yes, that does still occur.
Jacob asks, do you have any comment on the issues of trying to increase density in places without municipal sewer and water supply, as in much of rural New York?
Right. Nicole, do you want to?
Yeah, so as far as the need to increase density or just the resulting factor, and I think, there's a realistic cost that goes along with any infrastructure that comes in, whether it be housing or for water and sewer. And so one sometimes cannot happen without the other. And I think there's that understanding of how that has to occur. And so as communities look at what their infrastructure is from either a water and sewer standpoint, they can look at what is appropriate for being able to accommodate the right mix of density as they go forward.
And I will say, town of Etoka's, the requirement for the site plan also comes into play if you are on a lot that's not served by public water and sewer. So that's obviously a concern. Not every on-site septic system has been set up to accommodate an extra bedroom or two. So, and even if it is going through a building permit ministerial component, it is a requirement of the building inspector to ensure that, if you are putting in an additional unit, whether it's a 1 or 2 bedroom attached or detached unit, that you have to comply with the health regulations. So within a rural area without water and sewer, you're not likely to see necessarily the increase in density that you're going to see in a more urban area. It might be more obvious to the neighbors once you add it in a rural area, but I think certainly the lack of water and sewer services should not be a limiting factor, and provided you follow all the requirements, and certainly creating another septic field is going to be more onerous than tapping into your existing municipal water or sewer system. So, there are clearly differences, rural versus urban.
Yep.
This question starts by saying, referring to tiny homes, manufactured homes, are town codes able to differentiate from what some people may think of as trailers, as in trailer parks or RVs, versus the more manufactured types? And are people actually trying to use the trailer types as accessory dwelling units?
Right. So since 1976, mobile homes are now really referred to as manufactured homes. So in the building code, the technical term is no longer a mobile home. That's essentially a portable home built prior to 1976. There's some specific date in there in March. And subsequent to that, they're held to new building standards. So they're called manufactured homes, but they're essentially the same thing. They come in on a trailer, either a single or double wide, and they're brought into a mobile home park or outside of a park and attached to a permanent foundation. And I can't say that we've seen individuals trying to use those as accessory dwelling units. I will say in the SOPUS, that was certainly a concern. And, there were particular size limits put on those what is allowed in a SOPUS in an effort to ensure that the accessory dwelling unit, if it's detached, would not be a 70-foot by 80-foot single wide. Those are allowed anywhere in the state where a single family home is allowed. That's a recent building or a code change, I believe 2017, 2018.
Right.
But as I mentioned, as these manufactured home companies start to realize that there is a market for these smaller accessory dwelling units or tiny homes, and they also refer to them as camp homes or campground homes, and you can see these, they look like little chalets, etc. And others are building them on a platform that are brought in to the site and can be attached to a permanent foundation. So in a SOPUS, for example, if you want to bring in a manufactured structure that meets the size requirements, it would just have to be attached to a permanent foundation. It can't be left on its wheels and framed with skirting. It has to actually be permanent. So, that clearly was an issue when we were working through the SOPUS ones, and are likely to be elsewhere in the community, in the state. And we feel that the reasonable requirements are sufficient enough to avoid that type of concern where a single manufactured home is utilized as an ADU, because that at 70 feet just clearly would be contrary to most of the surrounding area, particularly in an urban area. Now, if it's a rural area, if you have significant acreage, that's a different story. And again, that's where I think communities have to be left up and given some leeway in terms of how they interpret those accessory dwelling units.
But it'll also have to be accessory to that principal dwelling. So it'll have to be smaller in size, whatever the threshold is. So that shouldn't be a significant concern.
Exactly.
And you may have covered this briefly, but the question from James is, are ADUs typically subject to the same lot line setbacks and zoning as the principal structure?
Typically they are, to jump in, most communities are using that for dwelling units to make sure that they follow those setback lines. And some of the challenges with that is communities might allow accessory structures to be outside those lot lines. So it makes it challenging to do a conversion when you can have a garage 5 feet from a setback line, but not other structures that would have a dwelling unit. So some communities are trying to look at those to see if there's ways to adjust if appropriate, but most of them are typically within those setback lines.
Yeah, and I will say that the state's pending legislation, I believe it prohibits communities from tying the accessory structure to the principal structure setback. So basically, if they allowed 5-foot setbacks for a garage or a shed, size limitations aside, because some communities, if it's over 1,000 square feet, and for a garage, it has to meet certain setbacks. So the state would be looking to align this with actual accessory structures. However, communities, I could totally understand how there's a concern. There's clearly a different impact between a shed 5 feet off your lot line and a new dwelling unit. So that's certainly something that has to be taken into consideration and probably go through some growing pains.
And there were a couple of questions dealing with ADUs as long-term leasing versus short-term rentals. So the first part of it was, how do you keep ADUs as long-term lease as opposed to being used for short-term rentals like Airbnb? And they refer to communities such as Ellicottville in Cattaraugus County, where they are losing long-term accessory apartments to short-term rentals. And then the related question is, how will a prohibition on short-term rentals in ADUs be enforced?
So, as I mentioned before, ASOPUS put a 5-year prohibition. So 5 years from the date of the certificate of occupancy. After that, within 5 or after 5 years, right now, and they could certainly revisit that. They could make it permanent. They would put that in. And in terms of, and that's fully within their right to do that. So you can require that. Obviously, any type of zoning is only as good as the enforcement. So also within ASOPUS, they've passed a short-term rental law that requires all short-term rentals to have a license that's annually renewed, and that in partnership with Ulster County, they have the access to all the data of all the short-term rental platforms, online platforms that are out there, because short-term rental owners have to pay an occupancy, a bed tax in Ulster County. So there's a good data source out there for the county and the town to know who's actually doing short-term rentals. So obviously somebody could skirt the process and fly under the radar, but that won't happen for very long. So in order to be able to properly regulate this, you also have to bring in that short-term rental regulation in order to keep track of those, and that way you have a better understanding if somebody's renting out their accessory dwelling unit for that purpose. So again, it's a new issue, and the communities have to have the tools in place. Otherwise, the laws won't be as effective as you'd like them to be.
How are we doing on time, Mark?
I think it would be a good time to wrap up. If the speakers could quickly share their maybe email address for any follow-up questions in the chat box. I know we didn't get to all the questions, and then we can wrap it up and do a note of thanks. So I'd just like to thank our speakers, Matt Rogers and Nicole Allen, and the LaBerge Group for sponsoring this session, and John Katner from the New York Planning Federation. I just wanted to also remind everyone that a recording of this session will be posted on the conference webpage, and the conference continues on October 6th at 12 p.m. with Exploring Stakeholder Engagement for Compensation, Equity, and Inclusion, and at 2 p.m. on the 6th, featuring age-friendly planning, Tompkins County and beyond. I suspect that will resonate with this presentation very well. So with that, thank you again for attending, and look forward to seeing you at future events.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was fun.
Thank you, everyone.